The Raiders didn't just play football, they built a legacy fueled by rebellion, grit, and bold ambition. From foggy Sundays in Oakland to primetime lights in Las Vegas, they've seen glory and heartbreak. But which moments define them the most? Today, we're not talking about individual players. We're ranking eras, entire periods. From the weakest to the most legendary, you might be surprised by what made the top and what didn't. In this video, we're diving deep into the 5 greatest chapters in Raiders history. Not just by wins or Super Bowls, but by what each era meant to the franchise. We'll look at playoff runs, leadership, locker room drama, cultural impact, and even the untold stories that shaped the Raiders' identity. Some of these eras featured epic comebacks. Others brought devastating losses, and one was nearly erased from memory. Stick around as we rank them all, from the humble beginnings to unforgettable dynasties. By the end, you'll know more about the Raiders' journey than most fans ever will. Welcome to History of Raiders, your home for all things silver and black. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment from the dark, thrilling world of Raider Nation. The story of the Raiders begins in 1960 when they were born into the upstart American Football League. But their entry wasn't glamorous. They were the last team added to the league, and they started with almost nothing, no stadium, no practice facility, and very little time to build a roster. They were a team that wasn't supposed to exist, and that made them hungry. Their first few seasons were hard, really hard. In 1961, they went to 12. The losses piled up, and so did the doubts. Fans didn't fill the stands, and the franchise was already being talked about as a possible failure. The Raiders didn't just lose games, they lost badly. They had no real stars, no structure, and no clear direction. But all of that was about to change. In 1963, everything shifted. That was the year Al Davis arrived as head coach and general manager. He was just 33 years old, but what he lacked in age, he made up for with attitude. Davis brought swagger to the team before they had even earned it. He wasn't interested in playing nice or fitting in. He was building something different. Tough, fast, and bold. He called it the vertical game. He wanted speed, big plays, pressure, and most of all, he wanted to win. The Raiders didn't suddenly become a powerhouse overnight, but Davis lit a fire. In just 1 year, they improved from 1-13 to 10-4. That kind of turnaround was almost unheard of at the time. It shocked the league, and more importantly, it gave the Raiders their first taste of identity, a rebellious, aggressive style. That became their signature for decades. Throughout the mid-1960s, the team remained inconsistent. One season they'd be a contender, the next they'd fall short. Injuries, weak defenses, and quarterback struggles held them back. But there were moments of brilliance, and in 1967, everything finally came together. That year, the Raiders finished with a 13-1 record, the best in the AFL. Quarterback Darryl Lamanika, who had arrived in a trade from Buffalo, threw deep bombs all season long. Wide receivers like Warren Wells and Fred Biletnikoff burned defenders week after week. The offense was explosive. The defense, led by hard hitters like Ben Davidson, was aggressive and unrelenting. They bullied their way to the AFL Championship, crushing the Houston Oilers 40-7. It was a statement win. The Raiders had arrived. That victory sent them to their first Super Bowl, Super Bowl II, against Vince Lombardi's Packers. But the dream fell short. The Raiders were outmatched and lost 33-14. Still, it marked a turning point. This wasn't a struggling expansion team anymore. They were real contenders, but the inconsistency returned. In 1968, they finished 1-2, but were upset in the AFL Championship by Joe Namath's Jets. The frustration was growing. For every step forward, they took one back. The promise was there, explosive players, a bold identity, and the fire of Al Davis. But during this era, the greatness was still forming. There were flashes of brilliance, but no dynasty yet. That would come later. When Jon Gruden arrived in Oakland in 1998, the Raiders were in a dark place. Years of instability and losing seasons. had worn down both the roster and the fans. But Gruden wasn't your typical coach. At just 34 years old, he brought energy, attitude, and a no-nonsense style that Raider Nation hadn't seen in years. From the moment he stepped in, Gruden demanded discipline. He focused on fundamentals, accountability, and sharp offensive play calling. The team didn't transform overnight, but the change was visible. The Raiders were no longer pushovers. By 1999, the pieces were starting to fall into place. The offensive line became tougher. The defense found its edge. And Gruden was calling games with a fiery passion that electrified both the players and the sidelines. A turning point came. In the 2000 season, that year, the Raiders went 12-4, winning the AFC West for the first time in a decade. Rich Gannon, a journeyman quarterback who had bounced around the league, found his rhythm under Gruden's system. He was efficient, confident, and smart, the perfect fit for Gruden's West Coast offense. The Raiders' ground game, led by Tyrone Wheatley and Napoleon Kaufman, pounded defenses into submission, and on defense, names like Rod Woodson and Eric Allen brought experience and swagger. The 2000 playoffs showcased how dangerous the Raiders had become. They bulldozed through the Miami Dolphins in the divisional round with a 27-0 shutout, a rare sight in postseason football. The energy was high. Fans believed that the team was destined for greatness. But in the AFC Championship game, the dream collapsed. The Baltimore Ravens, led by one of the most dominant defenses in NFL history, smothered the Raiders' offense. Gannon was knocked out of the game early with a shoulder injury. The final score was 16-3, and with it, the Raiders' Super Bowl. Hopes faded, then came 2001, a season that would go down in infamy. Once again, the Raiders looked strong. They finished 10-6 and made the playoffs for the second straight year. And once again, they looked like contenders. But in the AFC divisional round, they faced the New England Patriots in a snowy, unforgettable game in Foxborough. It would become known simply as the Tuck Rule game. Late in the fourth quarter, Charles Woodson sacked Tom Brady, causing what looked like a clear fumble. The Raiders recovered. The game appeared over. But after review, the officials invoked an obscure rule that classified Brady's motion as an incomplete pass, not a fumble. The Patriots kept the ball, tied the game, and won in overtime. It was one of the most controversial calls in NFL playoff history, and it changed everything. That was Gruden's last game as Raiders head coach. In a shocking move, he was traded to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers shortly after. The decision stunned fans and players alike. Just as the Raiders were reaching their peak, the architect of their rise was suddenly gone. And yet, the Gruden years left a lasting mark. The Raiders became relevant again. Games were exciting. Rivalries flared up. The silver and black had swagger. Gruden didn't win a Super Bowl with the Raiders, but he rebuilt their spirit, reshaped their style, and reignited belief across Raider Nation. The late 1990s were a strange time for the Raiders. Years of inconsistency and forgettable seasons had dulled the shine of a once great franchise. But in 1999, a spark was lit. That spark was Rich Gannon, a journeyman quarterback who had spent most of his career overlooked. When he arrived in Oakland, few expected what came next. By 2002, he would be the league MVP, and the Raiders would be marching to the Super Bowl. Gannon wasn't flashy. He didn't have the rocket arm of a Brett Favre or the highlight reel plays of a Michael Vick. What he had was control, precision, command. Under the right system, he became something special. And the Raiders, under head coach Jon Gruden, gave him that system. The chemistry between Gruden and Gannon was instant. Gruden was known for his complex play calling and fiery energy. Gannon was a quarterback who loved film, detail, and discipline. Together, they turned the Raiders' offense into one of the most efficient units in the NFL. From 1999 onward, the silver and black began to look dangerous again in 2000. Just one season after Gannon's arrival, the Raiders went 12-4 and made it all the way to the AFC Championship game. It was their first deep playoff run in years. They lost to the Baltimore Ravens, who had one of the most dominant defenses in NFL history that year. But the Raiders had made their statement. They were back. That same year, Gannon was selected to the Pro Bowl. It would be the first of 4 straight appearances. His style of play, quick reads, smart throws, and relentless tempo, wasn't just effective, it was redefining what the Raiders' offense could be. The days of just pounding the ball were over. Oakland had become a passing team, and for once, it worked. Then came the 2001 season, marked by controversy and heartbreak. The Raiders faced the New England Patriots in the AFC divisional round. That game, played in the snow in Foxborough, would go down in NFL history. In the final moments, Gannon appeared to have forced a fumble from Patriots quarterback Tom Brady. The Raiders recovered, thinking they had sealed the win, but the officials called it back, citing an obscure rule known as the tuck rule. Patriots kept the ball. They won. In overtime, the Raiders were stunned. That game changed everything. Jon Gruden, frustrated and burned out, was traded to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers just weeks later. A rare move for a head coach. Raiders owner Al Davis received draft picks and cash in return. But the Raiders lost their offensive mind, and Gannon lost his most trusted coach. The timing couldn't have been worse despite the shift in leadership. The 2000 season became Gannon's masterpiece. Under new head coach Bill Callahan, the Raiders didn't just stay competitive, they dominated. Gannon threw for over 4,600 yards, 26 touchdowns, and had a passer rating of 97.3. He led the league in multiple categories and won the NFL MVP award at age 37, an age when most quarterbacks are winding down. The team finished the regular season 11-5. They secured the number 1 seed in the AFC and stormed through the playoffs. Gannon dismantled the New York Jets in the divisional round, and then tore through the Tennessee Titans in the AFC Championship. The Raiders were going to the Super Bowl, their first trip since 1983. But fate wasn't done with them. Super Bowl 37 was supposed to be the crowning moment of Gannon's career. Instead, it became a nightmare. The Raiders faced the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, led by none other than Jon Gruden, the very coach they had traded away. Gruden knew the Raiders' playbook. Many of the signals and audibles used in the game were the same ones he had installed just a year prior. Tampa's defense, already elite, read the Raiders like a book. Gannon threw 5 interceptions, 3 of which were returned for touchdowns. The game slipped away fast. The final score was 48-21, one of the most lopsided defeats in Super Bowl history, and one of the most painful for Raider Nation. Still, the Gannon era left its mark. He remains one of the most statistically successful quarterbacks in franchise history. His 4 Pro Bowl appearances, his MVP award, and his leadership helped drag the team out of a dark stretch. He brought relevance back to the Raiders for a few short years. They were a top-tier team again, smart, efficient, and dangerous. The window closed quickly. Injuries would soon take their toll on Gannon. He never returned to the Super Bowl, but his time in silver and black, though brief, was unforgettable. When most people talk about Raiders legends, names like Madden and Al Davis dominate the conversation. But in the early 1980s, it was Tom Flores who quietly built one of the most resilient and unlikely championship runs in NFL history. And he did it while carrying the weight of being a trailblazer. The first Hispanic head coach in the league. The 1980 season didn't start like a title year. The Raiders had quarterback issues, a battered offensive line, and questions in the locker room. Expectations were low, but when veteran quarterback Jim Plunkett stepped in mid-season due to injury, something shifted. Plunkett wasn't supposed to be the hero. He'd been written off by the league. But under Flores, he became exactly that, with calm leadership and just enough fire. He led the Raiders on a late-season surge that would eventually become historic. That year, the Raiders entered the playoffs as a wild-card team, a spot usually reserved for long shots. No wild-card team had ever won the Super Bowl. But the Raiders didn't just make noise. They shook the league. They knocked off the Houston Oilers, stunned the Cleveland Browns in the infamous Red Right 88 game, and then dismantled the San Diego Chargers in the AFC Championship. By the time they reached Super Bowl 15, the doubters had run out of words. Against the heavily favored Philadelphia Eagles, the Raiders played with ruthless efficiency. Plunkett threw for 3 touchdowns and linebacker Rod Martin intercepted. 3 passes, a Super Bowl record that still stands. The Raiders won 27-10, becoming the first wild card team to win it all. It wasn't just a win, it was a statement. And at the center of it was Tom Flores, calm on the sideline, letting the performance speak for itself. But the Raiders weren't done. In the seasons that followed, they stayed a constant threat. The early 1980s were marked by tough playoff battles and an unshakable sense of belief. In 1982, during a strike-shortened season, the Raiders again reached the postseason and pushed through the noise. Then in 1983, they moved to Los Angeles, a controversial decision at the time, but the success continued. The 1983 squad was one of the most balanced teams in Raiders history, offensively explosive, defensively ruthless. That year ended with another Super Bowl victory, this time in Super Bowl 18, where they destroyed Washington 38-9. It remains one of the most lopsided wins in Super Bowl history. Once again, Tom Flores had coached a team few expected to dominate and turned them into champions. Flores wasn't flashy, he didn't scream or showboat, but his quiet leadership and tactical mind gave the Raiders something they desperately needed: discipline, without dulling their edge. Under him, the team evolved from unpredictable and wild into a battle-hardened machine. There were still fights, there were still off-field headlines, but the 1,983 Raiders had something rare. They thrived under pressure, fed off being underestimated, and delivered when it mattered most. The 1970s were not just a turning point for the Raiders. They were the decade that made the Raiders. It was during this time that the team formed its identity: fierce, unpredictable, and utterly unapologetic. And at the center of it all stood John Madden. When John Madden became head coach in 1969, he was just 32 years old, one of the youngest head coaches in league history. Yet he didn't lead like a rookie. He was confident, vocal, and totally in sync with the rebellious spirit of his team. Madden wasn't just managing players. He was creating a movement, one that would shake the NFL. The Raiders of the 70s were a team built for prime time. They didn't care what the rest of the league thought. They weren't trying to win popularity contests, they were trying to win games. And they did that better than almost anyone. Under Madden's leadership, the Raiders posted a regular season record of 103 wins, 32 losses, and 7 ties. That's a winning percentage of over 75%, still one of the highest for any coach in NFL history. But what really set this era apart wasn't just the stats, it was the way they won. The Raiders became famous for their hard-hitting style, aggressive play calling, and wild finishes. The team was loaded with larger-than-life personalities, men who didn't just play football, but performed it with grit and style. There was quarterback Ken Stabler, nicknamed the Snake, who was as unpredictable as he was brilliant. There was wide receiver Fred Biletnikoff, whose sure hands and crisp routes made him a nightmare to cover. There was Jack Tatum, the assassin, whose bone-crushing hits became both feared and infamous. And then there was Gene Upshaw, Willie Brown, Cliff Branch, Otis Sistrunk. The list goes on. This wasn't just a team. It was a cast of characters that could have come out of a Hollywood script in 1976. Everything came together. That season, the Raiders stormed through the league with a 13-1 regular season record. They crushed the Patriots in the playoffs, took down the Steelers in the AFC Championship, and advanced to Super Bowl 11, where they dominated the Minnesota Vikings 32-14. It was their first Super Bowl win, and it was a long time coming. That victory was more than a championship, it was a statement. The Raiders had been to the Super Bowl before in 1967 but came up short. They had suffered crushing playoff losses in the early 70s, often to their bitter rivals, the Pittsburgh Steelers. But 1976 proved they could finish the job. It proved that the tough talking, wild-living Raiders could also be the best team in football. Yet even in seasons without a Lombardi trophy, the Raiders were a dominant force. They made the playoffs every single year from 1970 to 1977. They won 6 AFC West titles in 8 years. They reached the AFC Championship game 7 times in that span. No matter who they faced or how the odds were stacked, the Raiders were never an easy out. Every team in the league knew if you were playing the Raiders in the postseason, you were in for a war. John Madden himself never had a losing season as head coach. He retired in 1978 due to health reasons, but not before leaving behind a legacy that would define the franchise for decades. His larger-than-life personality would later become a household name through the Madden NFL video games, but for Raider fans, he'll always be the man who led the team through its most glorious era. And what made this period even more impactful was how it shaped the Raiders' image. The team leaned into its role as the NFL's outlaws. They wore black, they talked trash, they picked fights, and they won. The NFL might not have liked it, but fans couldn't get enough. The Raiders became a cultural symbol, especially for working-class America. They stood for rebellion, for independence, for doing things your way, and not apologizing afterward. They didn't just play on Sundays, they became a brand, a myth, and that myth was born in the 1970s. There were other strong periods in Raider history, some with incredible players, others with dramatic moments, but no other era combined success, swagger, and legacy quite like the Madden years. It was the era that turned the Raiders into the Raiders, and it all began with a young coach, a roster full of misfits, and a mission to prove that football could be played loud, fast, and fearless. We started with the early struggles of the 1960s, where the foundation was laid brick by brick. Then came the explosive Gruden era, full of promise, energy, and controversy. The Rich Gannon years followed, bringing sharp execution and a shot at greatness. Tom Flores led a team that thrived under pressure and captured 2 Super Bowl titles. And finally, the 1970s dynasty under John Madden, tough, relentless, and absolutely iconic, stands as the Raiders' greatest era. Each of these periods shaped the DNA of Raider Nation. They brought new stars, bold decisions, and unforgettable moments. From Oakland's grit to Los Angeles swagger and now Vegas flair, the identity has evolved. But the soul remains the same now as the team enters a new era in Las Vegas. The future is wide open. Will they rise again and add a new chapter to this legacy? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain, the story of the Raiders is far from over. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Raiders history, give this video a like and share it with a fellow fan. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, History of Raiders, for more stories from the past, present, and future of Raider Nation. Got a favorite era we missed? Or a topic you'd like us to cover next? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.